"What's this old thing doing here? Do we have room for it?" my wife shouted. Her words cut through the silence in the room like broken glass. I stood still, my hands trembling, staring at the tea stain slowly spreading across the light-colored carpet. A simple accident. My hand, which no longer has the steadiness it once had, faltered as I picked up the cup. The hot liquid didn't hurt my skin, but the humiliation burned deep into my soul. My son, Lucas, stood there, not knowing what to say. He looked at me, then at her, his face red with shame. His cowardice hurt almost as much as her contempt. I said nothing. I just bent down slowly, my knees creaking, and began to dry the floor with a paper napkin. Every movement was slow and heavy. I was no longer José, the builder who had built that house with his own hands. I was just that old man, a nuisance, an old dusty piece of furniture taking up space in a corner. If you were moved by my story, subscribe to the channel. Life in old age can be hard, but memory and hope can keep us alive. Follow my story and see how I deal with it. That night, I couldn't sleep. The small room at the back of the house, which used to be my tool shed, felt like a prison. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and saw the face of Anna, my late wife. We designed this house together. I laid each brick, thinking of her smile. Every pipe I ran through the walls, every electrical wire I connected, everything was done with love to be our nest. And now, in that same nest, I was treated like an intruder. My wife's words echoed in my head. Extra space. They didn't see the space I had filled my whole life with work and sweat. They saw only an old and useless body. It was there, in the cold darkness of that room, that a different flame ignited within me. It was not the hot flame of anger, but the cold blue fire of revenge. Did they think I was useless? Did they think I was good for nothing? Well, I would use my knowledge, my intimacy with every beam and every nail in this house, to show them the true value of an old builder. The house I built for love would become my weapon. I started the next day. My plan was simple and silent. My revenge would make no noise. It would whisper in the corners, drip from the ceiling, blow through the cracks. I climbed into the attic, a place they never visited, full of old boxes and dust. The smell of old wood brought me a strange calm. With the precision of someone who had done this all his life, I located the pipe that ran directly above their bedroom. I didn't need to break anything, just a small wrench and a slight adjustment to a joint, a minimal, almost imperceptible tightening, enough to allow a single drop of water to escape every few minutes. Slow torture. It would take days, maybe weeks, for the stain to appear on the plaster ceiling, and when it did, it would be a mystery, a problem with no apparent cause. I came down from the attic feeling a power I hadn't felt in a long time. I was no longer a victim. I was the ghost in my own machine. Weeks passed. I watched everything from my corner, quiet as always. The first complaint came from my wife. "Lucas, there's a damp spot on the ceiling of our bedroom," she said during dinner. My son looked up, as if he could see through the floor. "It must be a broken tile," he replied, unconcerned. Over the weekend, he climbed onto the roof, walked back and forth, and found nothing. The stain, small and yellowish, continued to grow, slowly and stubbornly. They called in a professional, a young man named Thomas, who inspected the roof in the attic. "Sir, I can't find any leaks. The piping looks dry. The roof is perfect. It's very strange," he said, scratching his head. The frustration on my wife's face was delightful. She stared at the stain angrily as if it were a personal insult. Their sanctuary was being invaded by an invisible enemy. My second step was cold. I knew the weak spot in the insulation of their bedroom, a place behind a baseboard where I myself, in my haste during construction, had left a small flaw. It was a secret between me and the walls. One afternoon when they were out, I entered their bedroom. The scent of her perfume was everywhere. For a moment I felt a pang of guilt, but the memory of her cruel voice erased it. With a small tool, I carefully removed the baseboard, widened the gap to the outside, and put it back in place. It was a clean, invisible job. The draft that would come in through there would be thin as a blade, cold and constant, especially on winter nights. Soon the complaints began. "This room is freezing," my wife complained, wrapped in 2 blankets. "Did you leave the window open?" My son denied it, confused. They turned up the heat, but the cold air persisted, an icy ghost that tormented them throughout the night. The energy bill went up, and with it, the arguments. The final revenge was the door, the bathroom door in their room. During another of their outings, I went there with a small wooden wedge, thin as a sheet of paper, and a drop of strong glue. I placed the wedge on the inside of the door frame at the exact point where the door fit when closed. The result was perfection and annoyance. Sometimes the door closed normally. Other times, it would jam shut, requiring a violent push to open or close. There was no pattern. It was a random and maddening problem. I could hear them struggling with the door. Sometimes my son would be stuck in the bathroom for a few minutes. My wife would scream in frustration. "This house is falling apart," she yelled one night. "Everything is breaking at once." Little did she know that the house wasn't breaking. It was just obeying its creator. I remained in my armchair, reading my book, a silent spectator to the chaos I myself had orchestrated. They lived in a state of constant stress, the leak that had no source, the cold that had no entrance, and the door that had a mind of its own. Their perfect home had become a place of discomfort. One night, during yet another discussion about the house's problems, my exhausted son finally said something that made me feel a dark sense of victory. "I don't know what to do anymore, Julia. Maybe we should ask my father. He built this place. He knows every corner." My wife was silent for a moment. For the first time, she looked at me, not with contempt, but with a glimmer of need. In that look, I saw recognition. They didn't need my love or my company, but now they needed my usefulness. The old man who was good for nothing was suddenly their only hope. I didn't smile. I just slowly lowered my book and met her gaze. Revenge did not bring me joy, but it gave me back my place. I was the foundation of that house, and a foundation, however old and invisible it may be, has the power to shake everything above it. I kept my expression neutral, feeling the weight of their gazes on me. The silence in the dining room stretched out, tense as a violin string. Julia stared at me with a mixture of impatience and a small, almost invisible dose of hope. Lucas, on the other hand, looked like a boy caught in a prank, relieved to have passed the responsibility on to someone else. I closed the book, marking the page with my finger, and placed it on the small table next to the armchair. My every movement was deliberately slow. I wanted them to wait. I wanted them to feel the weight of that request. I stood up, my bones protesting in a chorus of low cracks. "Let's see," I said, my voice a little hoarse from disuse. I followed Lucas upstairs. Julia came right behind us, her steps hurried and irritated in the hallway. Their room was the largest in the house, the master bedroom, which Anna and I had designed for ourselves. Seeing it occupied by them with her clothes scattered on a chair and the strong smell of her perfume in the air always caused me a dull pain. Lucas pointed to the ceiling. "It's there, Dad. The stain." I looked at the yellowish mark, my masterpiece of patience. I feigned surprise, tilting my head like a doctor evaluating a strange symptom. Strange. The tile I replaced last year is on the other side. I walked to the window and ran my hand along the frame. "And this cold you're talking about, where does it come from?" Julia snorted. "That's what we want to know. It looks like there's a hole in the wall." I approached the baseboard I had altered. I crouched down with difficulty and tapped the wood lightly. The structure seemed solid. Sometimes the insulation material settles over time, creating small air pockets. It was an explanation that meant nothing, but it sounded professional. Finally, I went to the bathroom door. Lucas pushed it. It stuck. He used his shoulder and it opened with a snap. And there's that. One day it works, the next it doesn't. I held the handle and moved the door back and forth. My little wooden wedge was invisible, doing its silent work. "It could be moisture," I suggested. "Wood swells with weather changes. I'll sand the side. That should fix it." I grabbed my toolbox from my room. Under their watchful eyes, I sanded the side of the door, creating a little wood dust on the floor. It was theater. The problem wasn't there, but they didn't know that. I closed and opened the door a few times. It worked perfectly. "I think that fixes it," I said without looking them in the eye. Lucas looked relieved. "Thanks, Dad." Julia said nothing, but her gaze was one of satisfied distrust, as if I had finally fulfilled a basic obligation. That night the house was quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a truce that I knew wouldn't last. A week later, the door started to stick again. The cold returned with the longer nights, and the stain on the ceiling took on a darker hue around the edges. Their frustration was palpable, a sour smell in the house. That's when I decided to take my next step, the electricity. There was a junction box hidden behind a false panel in the hallway closet, another peculiarity of the construction that only I knew about. One afternoon while they were working, I opened the panel. The colored wires were like old friends. With a pair of pliers, I slightly loosened the terminal screw that carried power to the outlet next to Julia's bed, just enough to create a bad connection. It wasn't dangerous. It wouldn't cause a fire. It would just create the most annoying of problems. Flickering. The first complaint came 2 days later. "My lamp is flickering," I heard Julia shout from the bedroom. "It must be the bulb," Lucas replied, his voice tired, not wanting any more problems. They changed the bulb. The problem persisted. Then she tried to plug her cell phone charger into the outlet. Nothing. The next day, the outlet worked again. Then it stopped again. It was an electrical ghost, a defect that appeared and disappeared at will. The tension between them grew to a level I had never seen before. Every little defect in the house became the trigger for a bigger argument about money, about life, about their unhappiness. "We can't call another technician, Julia. Thomas already cost us a fortune and found nothing." "So are we going to live like this? In a haunted house that's falling apart?" The house wasn't haunted. It was just responding to its master. They called an electrician, a man named Ricardo in his 40s, with the expression of someone who has seen it all. I watched him from the doorway of the bedroom, sitting sitting quietly in my reading chair in the hallway. Ricardo tested the outlet, the lamp wiring, the circuit breaker on the power panel. Honestly, ma'am, everything is normal. The power is coming through. I don't see any short circuit. At that very moment, the outlet was working perfectly, by pure chance. I smiled behind my book. Julia looked at the electrician angrily. Are you calling me crazy? I know what I saw. Ricardo, embarrassed, just shrugged. I can replace the outlet if you want, but I don't think it will solve the problem. They paid for the visit and for a useless outlet replacement. When he left, Julia turned to Lucas, her face red. It's your father. I'm sure of it. Ever since he messed with that door, everything has gotten worse. He's old. He doesn't know what he's doing anymore. He's destroying our house. Those words hit me in a different way. Not with the humiliation of the first time, but with icy clarity. She didn't see incompetence. She saw malice. She was close to the truth, but for the wrong reason. She thought I was a senile old man ruining things without meaning to. The idea was almost more insulting than the truth. That night, their fight was the worst of all. I heard doors slamming. I heard Julia's voice, sharp and cruel. I can't stand living here anymore, not with him. And then, the sound of Lucas's car engine starting, leaving behind a heavy silence full of hatred. I stayed in my room, looking at the old photo of Anna on my bedside table. Her smile seemed to ask me what I was doing. Was I defending our home or destroying it? Revenge, which had once seemed like armor, now felt like a cage I had built myself. The blue fire inside me hadn't gone out, but it had flickered. For the first time, I wondered where this path would lead. I would show them the value of an old builder, yes, but at what cost? Would the cost be the house itself? Would the cost be what was left of my son? The house was silent, but inside me the storm was just beginning. I had the power to shake the foundations, but now I realized that in doing so, I could also be buried by the rubble. The night dragged on, heavy and starless. The sound of Lucas's car disappeared in the distance, leaving a void that seemed to suck all the air out of the house. I didn't hear Julia cry or walk around the room. Her silence was more frightening than her screams. It was the silence of someone who had reached their limit. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, holding Anna's photo in my hands. What would she say if she saw me now? If she saw the house we built to be a home turn into a battlefield? Revenge gave me power, but it also filled me with an icy loneliness. I was proving my worth, but the price was the peace of my own family, what little remained of it. Julia's accusation that I was a senile old man breaking things hurt in a new way. She didn't see me as an intelligent enemy, but as an incompetent one, and that somehow was worse. I needed one last act, one that couldn't be mistaken for accident or old age, one that would show, without a shadow of a doubt, that the house had a master, and that master was me. The next morning, the house was strangely quiet. Lucas hadn't returned. When I left my room, I found Julia in the kitchen, sitting at the table with an untouched cup of coffee. She hadn't slept. Her eyes were red and swollen, and there was a pallor to her face that I had never seen before. She didn't look at me with anger, but with deep exhaustion, like a soldier worn down by a war she didn't understand. She looked small and lost in that big kitchen I had designed for Anna. For a moment, I felt a twinge of something that resembled pity, but the memory of her cruel words was like a stone wall inside me. I just made my own coffee in silence and sat down in my armchair. We didn't exchange a single word. The silence between us was thick, full of unspoken things. She was alone, trapped in a house that had turned against her, and the person responsible for that was sitting a few feet away, watching her over a book. My final plan involved the heart of the house, hot water. It was the invisible comfort that everyone hopes to have. That hot shower at the end of a tiring day, warm water to wash your face in the morning. Taking that away from them would be like ripping the soul out of the comfort of home. In the basement, behind a pile of old boxes, was the water heater, a sturdy machine that I had installed myself more than 20 years ago. I knew every valve, every copper pipe, every little secret of how it worked. There was a small pressure regulator, an internal part that no one would ever think to check. With a special wrench that I kept in my toolbox, I made a tiny adjustment, almost nothing. Not enough to break the machine, but enough to make it work unpredictably. Sometimes the water would heat up normally, other times it would only get lukewarm, and at the worst moments it would come out as cold as an ice cube. It would be another ghost to haunt them, the most personal and uncomfortable of all. 2 days later, the crisis erupted. I heard Julia's shrill scream coming from the upstairs bathroom, followed by the sound of water being turned off violently. "Not again!" she yelled into the void. That night she tried to wash the dishes and the hot water didn't come. Her frustration turned to despair. She called Lucas and I could hear her voice on the phone, a mixture of crying and anger. "You have to come home. I can't take it anymore. The whole house is against me." Lucas came back the next day. His face was haggard. He didn't look like he had slept or eaten. The war at home was destroying him too. They called a plumber, a man named Sergio, who spent the entire afternoon in the basement. I watched him from afar. He tested the pressure, checked the connections, measured the temperature. "Look, sir," he said to Lucas, "the machine seems to be working perfectly now. I can't find any fault." At that moment, of course, the heater was running like clockwork. Sergio's visit only served to increase the tension and decrease their bank account. That night's fight was different. It wasn't explosive. It was low and desperate. They were in the bedroom, but their tired voices reached me. It's not normal, Lucas. None of this is normal, Julia said. The leak, the cold, the door, the light, now the water. It's as if the house, as if it doesn't want us here. There was a long pause. Then I heard their footsteps in the hallway. They stopped in front of my armchair. Lucas looked like a boy about to confess a mistake. Julia was at his side, her arms crossed, but her gaze no longer held contempt. It held something else. Surrender. Dad, Lucas began, his voice low. We need your help. You know this house better than anyone. Please, what's going on? Julia said nothing, but her eyes confirmed the request. It was the moment I had been waiting for, the final victory. They weren't asking me to fix a pipe, they were asking me to save their home. They were admitting that without me, they were lost within the walls I had built. I got up slowly. The act had to be perfect. Let's see what I can do, I said, my voice firm. I went from room to room, like an old doctor visiting a sick patient. In the attic, with them watching me, I tightened the pipe joint, fixing the leak. It was a little loose with the change in temperature, I explained. In their bedroom, I removed the baseboard, pretended to adjust the insulation and put it back in place, closing the air passage. The material had given way a little. In the bathroom, I took the door off its hinges, sanded an imaginary spot, and put it back, removing my small wooden wedge in the process. Behind the panel in the hallway, I tightened the screw on the junction box. Bad contact. It happens over time. Finally, I went down to the basement and with the same special wrench undid my adjustment to the water heater. In less than an hour, the house was cured. Peace was restored. The ghosts I had created were exorcised by their own creator. That night, the house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, a quiet of relief. The shower water ran hot and steady. Their bedroom was warm. The bathroom door closed softly. They didn't thank me with words, but I didn't need them. The respect was in the way Julia served me dinner, in the way Lucas looked at me before going to bed. I was no longer an old piece of furniture. I was the guardian of the house. Revenge did not bring me happiness, but it gave me back something more important, my purpose. They understood without me having to say a word that I was not a nuisance taking up space. I was the space itself. I was the memory, the foundation, and the structure. And in order to live in peace, they would always need the old builder who lived in the back room. The following weeks passed in a strange and fragile peace. The house functioned perfectly. The water was hot. The lights didn't flicker. The doors closed without complaint. Julia moved around the house with a new caution. She served me dinner, asked if I needed anything, but her words were like pieces of glass, carefully placed so as not to break the silence. There was no longer contempt in her gaze, but there was no warmth either. There was a kind of fearful respect, the kind of respect one gives to a force of nature that one does not understand, like a river that could flood at any moment. Lucas seemed lighter, relieved to no longer be living on a battlefield. He tried to strike up conversations about unimportant things, like the weather or the garden. I responded with short sentences, maintaining my position as an observer. I had what I wanted. I was no longer invisible, but victory tasted like dust. The power I felt was lonely. I was the king of a silent castle, where my subjects walked on tiptoe. Revenge gave me back my place, but it didn't give me back my family. One night, a different sound broke the silence. It wasn't a rhythmic drip or a high-pitched whistle. It was a low, constant murmur coming from inside the living room wall. It sounded like an underground river. At first, I was the only one who noticed it. My ears, accustomed to every crack and sigh in this house, identified the anomaly immediately. I knew that sound wasn't my doing. It was the house itself speaking, and its voice was one of pain. The next morning, the sound was louder. Lucas heard it while drinking his coffee. "What's that noise?" he asked, looking at the wall with a frown. Julia stopped setting the table and strained her ears. "It sounds like running water," she said, her voice laden with familiar anxiety. I said nothing, just watched the dark stain that was beginning to form at the baseboard, like a tear running down the light-colored paint. This time, the ghost was real. The stain grew rapidly. In 2 days, it was an ugly, damp mark that ran up the wall. Panic returned to Julia's face and exhaustion to Lucas's. The truce was over. "I'm going to call Sergio again," said Lucas, picking up the phone with trembling hands. "He'll think we're crazy calling him all the time," Julia replied, biting her nails. They didn't ask me anything. The memory of previous problems was still fresh, but this one was different. It was a big, noisy, visible problem. For them, it was a problem for professionals, not for an old man who fixed stuck doors. Sergio arrived that afternoon. He knocked on the wall, used a device to detect moisture, and shook his head. "The main pipe burst inside here," he announced. "It's a big job. I'll have to break down a good part of this wall to find the leak. It's going to be messy and expensive." I saw Lucas's shoulders slump. Julia closed her eyes, as if she had received a sentence. The house, which had given them peace for a few weeks, was once again their torture. And this time, I wasn't the executioner. They argued quietly in the kitchen about the budget, about the inconvenience. I listened to them, sitting in my armchair, smelling the mold that was beginning to emanate from the damp wall. It was the smell of decay, of the house aging, just like me. I couldn't let that happen. Not like that. that. Breaking down the wall I had built so carefully, brutally and without knowledge seemed like a violation. I stood up and the simple movement made them both shut up and look at me. I walked over to the kitchen wall on the other side of the leak. I tapped on a specific tile near the floor. The sound was different, more hollow. "You don't need to break the living room," I said, my voice firm. "The access is here." They looked at me without understanding. Sergio, the plumber, crossed his arms with an air of superiority. "Sir, with all due respect, I know my job. The leak is on the other side." I ignored him and looked at my son. "Lucas, bring me my toolbox and a thin spatula." For a moment, Lucas hesitated. He looked at the professional and then at me. It was a choice between paid experience and his father's forgotten wisdom. Then he nodded and went to get my tools. Julia watched everything in silence, her face a mask of doubt and hope. With the spatula, I began to remove the grout around that single tile. It was slow work, requiring the patience that only age teaches. The tile came out whole, revealing not concrete, but a small wooden plate. I removed it, and there it was, a small compartment exactly as I had designed it 30 years ago, with the copper pipes shining in the dim light. A small drop of water was forming at one of the connections. Sergio approached, open-mouthed. "How did you know that?" "I built it," I replied simply. As I dried the area and prepared to repair the joint, Lucas crouched down beside me. He wasn't just watching. He handed me tools, cleaned the parts, helped. We worked in silence for almost an hour. In that small space, we weren't the frustrated son and the resentful father. We were two men taking care of our home. When the job was almost done, with the new joint tightened and dry, Lucas spoke, his voice so low that Julia couldn't hear. "Dad, those other problems, the leak, the cold, they weren't a coincidence, were they?" I stopped what I was doing for a second. I didn't look at him. I just kept tightening one last screw. "This house has a lot of memories, son," I said. "Sometimes it just needs to be reminded of who takes care of it." That was all I said. He didn't ask any more questions. I put the wooden board and tile back in place. The repair was done. Without noise, without mess, without a dent in their budget. That night, the house was quiet again, but it was a silence unlike any other. It was a peaceful silence. After dinner, while I was reading in my armchair, Julia approached me. She didn't bring me a cup of tea as an obligation, but as an offering. She placed it on the small table beside me. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time the words sounded genuine. I just nodded. She stood still for a moment and then looked around, at the walls, at the ceiling. "You really built all this, didn't you?" "Every brick," I replied. She smiled, a small but real smile. The first she had given me in years. I was no longer a ghost or a threat. I was the builder. Revenge did not bring me peace, but love for my work, for my home, did. And by saving her, perhaps I had begun to save what was left of my family as well. The peace that settled in the house was heavy, like a thick blanket on a hot night. It was a peace born of fear, not affection. Julia moved with forced lightness, her footsteps in the hallway almost silent. She passed me the salt shaker at the table before I asked for it. Lucas tried to fill the silence with conversations about the weather or the garden. They were empty words, fragile bridges over an abyss of resentment. I had won. I had proven my worth. But victory was a cold meal, eaten alone in a corner of the table. I was respected, but I remained a stranger in my own home. The guardian of the castle was not invited to the king's banquet. At night, in my room, I talked to Anna's photo. "Did you see, my love? They listen to me now," I whispered to the portrait, but her smile on the paper seemed distant. I wasn't sure she would approve of my methods. The home we had built for love had become my instrument of war, and every war, even a victorious one, leaves deep scars. A month later, the routine of truce was broken not by a pipe or a wire, but by an official envelope in the mailbox. Lucas opened it at the breakfast table. His eyes quickly scanned the document, and his face turned pale. "I don't believe it," he muttered. Julia leaned over to read over his shoulder. "What is it?" she asked, her voice already tense. "It's a notice from the city," Lucas said, throwing the paper on the table. "They're going to widen the street, and to do that, they need to remove the tree in front." I stopped stirring my coffee. The tree. It wasn't just any tree. It was the big oak tree that Anna and I planted the day we moved in, more than 40 years ago. It was a thin, fragile branch at the time. Today its huge branches covered the front of the house like a protective embrace. It was the first thing I saw in the morning and the last thing I saw at dusk. It was more than wood and leaves. It was time. It was our history. "They can't do that," I said, and it was the first complete sentence I had spoken to them in weeks. Lucas looked at me with pity. "Dad, it's an official order. There's nothing we can do. They say the roots are damaging the sidewalk. Then we'll pay for the sidewalk to be repaired," Julia quickly suggested. She didn't care about the tree, but about the inconvenience. "It's not that simple," Lucas sighed, running his hand through his hair. "It's an urbanization project. Our tree is in the way. They'll compensate us with a symbolic amount and that's it." For them, it was a logistical problem, an item to be crossed off a to-do list. They didn't see the soul of that tree. They didn't remember Lucas as a child trying to climb it and falling on his butt in the grass. They didn't know that its shade was where Anna read her books on summer afternoons. They saw an obstacle. I saw a member of the family about to be executed. The blue fire inside me, which had been dormant began to spark again, but this time it wasn't for me. It was for the tree. It was for Anna. That afternoon, a man from the city came to make the markings. He was young, wore an orange vest, and carried a clipboard. With a spray of red paint, he made a large X on the trunk of the oak tree. That mark was like a stab in my chest. I left the house and went up to him. "What do you think you're doing?" I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. The young man, named Thomas, looked at me in surprise. "Sir, I'm just doing my job. We've been ordered to mark the trees that are going to be removed." "Well, you can erase that mark," I said, placing myself between him and the tree. "This tree isn't going anywhere." Thomas looked embarrassed. "Sir, I can't do that. If you have a complaint, you need to go to the sub-city hall." Lucas ran out of the house. "Dad, please come inside. Don't cause any trouble." He apologized to the employee, who left shaking his head. "Have you gone crazy?" Lucas shouted at me as we went inside. "Do you want to get arrested? It's just a tree." "Not for me," I replied, feeling the weight of all my battles. "Not for your mother. What would you do in my place? How would you react to such coldness? Share your opinion in the comments. I want to know if you understand me and would support me in this situation." Their fight that night was about money, about the cost of hiring a lawyer to fight the city hall, a fight that, according to Lucas, was lost before it even began. "It's throwing money away, Julia, money we don't have," and he said. "Then let your father deal with it alone," she replied. I heard everything from my room. They didn't understand that it wasn't about laws or money. It was about memory. The next morning I didn't say anything. I just grabbed my old toolbox and went to the basement. I rummaged through dusty boxes until I found what I was looking for, a large cardboard tube, yellowed by time. Inside were the original blueprints of the house, the drawings that Anna and I made together, sitting at the table in our old kitchen. I spent hours poring over those papers, smelling the scent of history, and then I found it, a small note in the corner of the site plan written in Anna's elegant handwriting. Original boundary marker, oak tree planted 2 meters inside the boundary. I took the plan to the living room and opened it on the coffee table. Lucas and Julia looked at me, confused. "What is this?" Lucas asked. "It's the proof," I said. I pointed to Anna's note and the line marking the boundaries of our property. "The city is wrong. The tree is not on public land. It is entirely within our property. The trunk, at least. They can't cut it down. At most, they can prune the branches that hang over the street." Lucas picked up the plan, his eyes wide. He compared the old drawing with the city hall notification. There was a small but crucial difference in the maps. Theirs was new, digitized, and probably inaccurate. Mine was old, handmade, and accurate. This might work," he said, a glimmer of hope in his voice. Julia approached, looking at the plant with a new kind of curiosity. "Where did you find this?" "I didn't find it," I replied. "I kept it, because in this house nothing is just a thing. Everything has a story." The next day Lucas didn't go to work. We both went to the sub-city hall. He, with his executive briefcase. Me, with my cardboard tube under my arm. We sat in a waiting room for almost 2 hours. When they finally called us in, an engineer named Ricardo greeted us with an air of weariness. He listened to Lucas's explanation with impatience, but when I opened the original blueprint on his desk, his expression changed. He picked up a ruler, measured the lines, checked the notes. He called another employee. They discussed in low voices, looking at my plan, and then at the computer screen. Finally, Ricardo turned to us. "Gentlemen, it seems there was an error in our cadastral survey. The oak tree is in fact on private property. We will have to reevaluate the project. The tree stays." On the way back, Lucas drove in silence, but it wasn't a tense silence. It was a silence of admiration. "How did you know, Dad? After so many years?" "I didn't know," I said, looking out the window. "Your mother knew. She was always the head. I was just the arms. When we got home, Julia was waiting for us at the door." "So?" she asked, the anxiety visible on her face. "The tree stays," said Lucas with a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. Julia smiled too, a smile of genuine relief. That night dinner was different. They asked me questions about the construction of the house, about Anna's notes on the blueprints. For the first time in years, we didn't talk about problems or bills. We talked about the past. I told them about how Anna chose the color of the kitchen tiles, about how she insisted on a large window in the living room so she could watch the tree grow. I was no longer the old man in the back room. I was the storyteller, the guardian of the memory of that place. Revenge gave me power, but it was memory that gave me back my family. By saving the tree, I wasn't just protecting a memory of Anna. I was giving them roots, a connection to the history of that house, which was now home to all of us. The silence that followed was neither fear nor peace. It was understanding, and it was a beginning. That beginning was quieter than I had imagined. There were no grand speeches or apologies. The change happened in the little things. Julia started asking me what was the best product to clean the wooden floor that I had laid myself. Lucas started calling me to watch football games on TV, sitting on the couch next to my armchair. chair, no longer on the other side of the room. They were small gestures, but they weighed more than any words. The respect I had forced with my silent revenge was gradually turning into something warmer, more like affection. The house breathed a sigh of relief. The silence was no longer tense, but comfortable. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged in the place I had built. I was no longer a ghost. I was the pillar. This peace lasted almost a year of quiet dinners, conversations about the garden, and smiles that didn't seem forced. I taught Lucas how to fix the back fence, and he taught me how to use my cell phone to see photos of the grandchildren of my old friend Alberto, who lived in another city. Julia discovered Anna's old recipes, stored in a notebook in the kitchen drawer, and began to try them out. The smell of the apple cake that Anna loved so much filled the house again, and for a moment it was as if she were there with us, smiling. The victory over the city hall and the saved tree became a family legend, a story they told to friends who visited them, and in that story, I was the hero. It was strange, but it was good. The storm, when it came, arrived without warning. On a rainy Tuesday, Lucas came home from work early. He didn't say anything, just walked in, put his briefcase on the chair, and stood in the middle of the room, staring into space. His face was gray, colorless. Julia came from the kitchen, drying her hands on a cloth. "Lucas, what happened? Are you okay?" He took a while to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was a hollow whisper. "I got fired. The company is cutting costs. Half of my department was let go today." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of rain hitting the window. I saw Julia's body stiffen. I saw despair take over my son's eyes. All the warmth we had built up that year seemed to drain out of the room, leaving behind a bitter cold. The following weeks were a nightmare. Lucas spent his days on the computer, sending out resumes, his face growing more and more dejected with each negative response. Julia tried to be strong, but I heard her crying softly in her room at night. The bills began to pile up. The food on the table became simpler. Conversations disappeared, replaced by tense, whispered discussions about money. I felt useless. My retirement was barely enough to pay for my own medications. I couldn't help them financially. All I could do was watch, silently, as the foundation of my family began to crack under the pressure. The house, which had become a home again, was once more a place of anxiety and fear. The terrible idea was uttered one Saturday night. I was in my armchair, pretending to read a book, but listening to their discussion in the kitchen. "We have no other choice, Lucas," Julia said, her voice choked with tears. "Our savings are gone. The next loan payment is due. And what do you want me to do? Do you want me to rob a bank?" he replied, his voice full of anger and despair. There was a long pause, and then Julia said the words that made my heart stop. "We can sell the house. It's too big for us. We can buy a smaller apartment, pay off our debts, and still have money left over until you find another job. Sell the house, Anna's house, the nest I built with my own hands." Each of her words was like a brick being torn from my chest. Lucas didn't respond right away. I could imagine him in the kitchen, running his hands through his hair, the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Julia, this is my father's house, where I grew up, and now it's our house," she retorted, "and it's sinking us. We have to be practical. It's either that or lose everything." I couldn't stay there any longer. I stood up, my knees cracking louder than usual. I walked into the kitchen. They both fell silent immediately, their faces frightened, like children caught doing something wrong. They looked at me, waiting for my reaction. The anger I felt was old and familiar, but this time I didn't let it consume me. I took a deep breath, seeking the calm that only age had given me. "I heard you," I said, my voice firm. "You're not going to sell this house." Julia opened her mouth to protest, but I raised my hand. "It's not an order, it's a request, but it's the only one I'll make." I looked at my son. "Lucas, I know things are difficult, but this house isn't just bricks and mortar. It's not a material possession." I walked over to the wall near the back door. There was a small mark on the wood of the doorframe, almost imperceptible. "Do you see this? This is where we measured your height every year on your birthday. The first mark, down here, is from when you were 3 years old and could barely reach the doorknob." I went to the living room window, which overlooked the big oak tree. "Your mother used to sit right here, in this armchair, and read to you while the rain fell outside. She said the tree branches looked like arms protecting us." I took them on a tour of the house, not as a builder, but as a guardian of memories. I showed them the stair step that creaks in a specific way, because Anna once tripped on it while carrying Lucas in her arms, and I never wanted to fix it, so I would always remember to be more careful. I showed them the small patch on the plaster in the hallway, hidden behind a picture, from when Lucas threw a ball inside the house and made a hole, and we both spent the afternoon trying to fix it before Anna arrived. Every corner had a story. Every stain, every scratch was a paragraph of our life. Julia started to cry, but this time it was a different kind of cry, without despair. It was a cry of understanding. Lucas looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a boy, a mixture of admiration and love. "Do you think money can buy this?" I asked, finishing my tour of the living room. "A new apartment won't have these stories. It won't have these good ghosts. It will just be a place to sleep." I went back to my armchair and sat down. I was tired, but at peace. I had used my my last weapon, love. We'll figure it out, I said, looking at them both. Together, in this house. Lucas approached and knelt in front of me, placing his hand on mine. His eyes were filled with tears. You're right, Dad. I'm sorry. I forgot. Julia came up behind him and placed her hands on Lucas's shoulders. We forgot, she corrected, her voice soft. That night, the house was not a financial burden. It was our anchor. Revenge gave me back my respect. Memory gave me back my family. But it was the crisis that finally made us a home. We would find a solution, not because we had to, but because we had something precious to protect. And that, I knew, was the strongest foundation I had ever built. Our union that night was silent. The three of us sat in the kitchen, not knowing what to say. The decision not to sell the house hung in the air, heavy as a concrete beam. It was a victory of the heart, but the real problem, the lack of money, was still there, sitting at the table with us. For the first time, however, the silence was not accusatory. It was a silence of companionship in difficulty, like three people in a small boat in the middle of a storm who decide to row together in the same direction, even without seeing dry land. I looked at Lucas and Julia's faces, now no longer marked by anger or contempt, but by a shared concern. The house was safe for now, but we needed to save ourselves. That's when the idea came, not like a bolt of lightning, but like the slow rise of the tide. It came from my craft, the only thing I really knew how to do. My eyes scanned the kitchen, the door frame, the floor that my hands had laid. I knew the bones of that house. The garage, I said, breaking the silence. They looked at me without understanding. The garage in the back. No one has used it in years. It's just a junk room. I continued, feeling excitement grow in my chest, a feeling I hadn't had in a long time. It has a separate entrance through the backyard. There's plumbing nearby, and the electrical wiring is independent. We can transform it. A small studio, a small, simple place to rent. It would generate extra income, enough to give us some breathing room. Lucas shook his head, discouragement returning to his eyes. Dad, that's a great idea, but with what money? Construction is expensive. Materials, labor, we have nothing. Julia nodded sadly in agreement. Your father is right, Lucas. We can't go into more debt. It was my turn to raise my hand, as I had done the night before. Labor? I said with a tired smile. The labor is sitting right here. I opened my hands on the table. They were wrinkled, stained by age, but they were still the hands of a builder. I'll do everything. The masonry, the plumbing, the electrical work. I have my tools. We can use a lot of reclaimed materials, and whatever we need we'll buy little by little. It will be slow, but it will be ours. I saw a spark of hope in my son's eyes. He looked at Julia, who was staring at me with newfound admiration. Can it work? She whispered to him. With Dad in charge, he replied. I think so. The next day marked the real beginning. We opened the door of the old garage and were greeted by a mountain of forgotten things. Boxes of Lucas's childhood toys, old furniture, rusty tools. The smell was of dust and stagnant time. We spent the first 2 days just cleaning and emptying the place. Each object we found was a story. Lucas found his old skateboard with a broken axle. I cried for a week when that happened, he said, laughing. Julia found a box of Lucas's school notebooks with drawings and essays. She read one aloud about what he wanted to be when he grew up. The three of us laughed together amid the dust. It wasn't just a physical cleanup. We were making room for the new, literally and metaphorically. When the space was cleared, I began the real work. Lucas became my apprentice. At first he was clumsy, holding the hammer with the same unfamiliarity of someone holding a strange animal. But he was hardworking. I taught him how to mix the cement in the right proportions, how to lay a row of bricks in a straight line, how to use a level to make sure the wall wasn't crooked. It's not strength, my son, it's technique, I repeated, guiding his hands. You need to feel the material, understand its weight. He listened to me with an attention he had never given me before, and I felt immense pride, not only for teaching my craft, but for seeing my son reconnect with the foundations of his own history. Julia brought us water, took care of logistics, researched material prices. She was the administrator of our small construction site. We faced problems, of course. When we broke part of the wall to install a larger window, we discovered an old leak that had compromised some of the wooden beams in the roof. Despair knocked on our door. Replacing those beams was far beyond our budget. Lucas sat on the dirt floor, his head in his hands. It's over. We're not going to make it. I felt the weight of defeat too, but I couldn't let it beat us. That's when I remembered Sergio, an old friend from my construction days. He was the best carpenter I ever knew. We hadn't seen each other in years. I swallowed my pride, picked up the phone and called him. I explained the situation, expecting a polite refusal. Sergio showed up the next morning with his toolbox and a smile on his face. So the old builder is back in business and alright, he joked. He looked at the roof, analyzed the rotten wood, and measured everything with his experienced eye. This is nothing that a little good wood and 2 helping hands can't fix, he said. He refused to accept any payment. Consider it payment for all the times you helped me put up a wall when my back seized up, he said. That week Sergio and I worked side by side, just like in the old days. Lucas watched us, fascinated by our harmony. We didn't need many words, a gesture, a glance, and we knew exactly what the other was thinking. Lucas learned more about friendship and loyalty in those days than in all his years at the office. With the roof repaired, the rest of the work flowed. Julia took over the final part. She found found a demolition materials store and bought beautiful wooden flooring at a very low price. She sanded and varnished each board herself. She painted the walls a light, airy color. She hunted for simple, functional furniture in second-hand stores, repairing and refurbishing each piece with a patience I didn't know she had. The old, dark, dusty warehouse was transformed into a cozy, light-filled place. When we were done, the three of us stood at the door, looking at our work. It wasn't luxurious, but it was solid, clean, and above all, it was a symbol of our union. We posted a simple ad on the internet. 2 days later, a young teacher named Clara came to visit the place. Her eyes lit up. "It's perfect," she said. "It's quiet and has so much light." She moved in the following weekend. On the first Monday of the month, Lucas walked into the kitchen holding an envelope. He placed it on the table. "The first rent," he said, his voice full of emotion. It wasn't an amount that would solve all our problems at once, but it was a start. It was proof that we could do things together. It was hope materialized in a small wad of cash. That night, dinner was almost a celebration. Julia made a pie, and we talked and laughed late into the night. I watched them, the way Lucas now sought my gaze to share a joke, the way Julia asked me for advice about the plants in the garden. The respect was no longer forced, it was genuine. The house, which had once been my weapon of revenge and then our anchor in the crisis, had become our tool for rebuilding. I realized that the strongest foundation I had ever built was not under the floor of that house. It was sitting right there, around that table, and for the first time in a long time I felt truly at home. The months that followed were like a long, calm dawn after a stormy night. Clara, our tenant, had a discreet and pleasant presence. Sometimes we would hear her playing the guitar softly in the late afternoon, and the melody would mingle with the smell of dinner that Julia was preparing in the kitchen. The rent money wasn't much, but it was the difference between sinking and keeping our heads above water. It paid the most urgent bills, bought food for the week, and gave us the luxury of breathing. The discussions about money didn't disappear, but they lost their tone of desperation. Now they were conversations about planning, about looking to the future with caution but also with a glimmer of hope. My routine also changed. I was no longer the ghost that haunted my own house. In the morning, I took care of the small front garden, a job that my back complained about but my soul was grateful for. Julia, who had barely noticed me before, now came to ask me for tips. "How can I make this flower more beautiful?" she would ask, pointing to a rose bush. And I, with my hands dirty from the soil, felt immense pleasure in sharing the little I knew. Lucas would come home from work and no longer go straight to his room. He would sit with me on the porch, sometimes in silence, just watching the movement on the street, other times telling me about problems at the office. He would ask for my opinion, not the opinion of a builder, but that of a father. I had regained my place, not by right, but by merit. In secret, one afternoon when the house was empty, I went up to the attic again. With the same wrench, I undid what I had done. I tightened the pipe joint, drying up the source of my silent revenge. I did the same with every little act of sabotage I had scattered around the house. I adjusted the hinge on the closet door so it would stop creaking, closed the small crack I had left in the bathroom window that created an inexplicable draft. Each repair was an act of repentance. I felt foolish for thinking that destruction could build something good. The peace I now enjoyed was real, achieved through hard work and unity, and I wouldn't risk it for anything. I believed I had buried the bitter old man I had become forever. But the foundations of a house hold secrets that even the builder doesn't remember. My revenge had been deeper than I imagined. About 6 months after our new beginning, the problem started in a different way. The kitchen light flickered from time to time. One day, the shower stopped heating up. Lucas, trying to be the man of the house, fiddled with the circuit breaker box, turning everything off and on, and things worked again for a while. "It must be the old wiring," he would say, frustrated. I felt a chill run down my spine every time something like this happened, but I convinced myself that it was just natural wear and tear on the house. I hadn't touched the main electrical system. Or had I? An old man's memory is no longer so reliable. The truth exploded one Saturday night. The three of us were in the living room watching a movie. Julia had bought an electric popcorn maker, a small luxury they celebrated. When she plugged it in, we heard a loud crack from the hallway followed by a strong burning smell. All the lights went out, plunging the house into total, silent darkness. It wasn't just a circuit breaker that had tripped. It was something more serious. Lucas grabbed a flashlight and we went to the main fuse box on the wall in the utility room. The smell of burnt plastic was unbearable there. One of the main circuit breakers was black and melted. "This isn't normal," Lucas said, his voice tense. "We've never had a problem like this before." Julia was hugging herself, scared. Could it catch fire? Her question hit me like a punch in the stomach. Fire, the only thing a builder fears more than water. The idea that the house I had built with so much love could be consumed by flames because of me was a terror I couldn't even name. At that moment, a memory came to mind, clear and cruel. In those days of anger, I remembered going to the power box. I didn't know much about complex electricity, but I knew the basics. I remembered loosening a screw on the main circuit breaker, Just a little. Enough to create a bad connection. A slow and invisible overheating over time. A time bomb that I had installed myself. The next day we called an electrician, a man named Marco, recommended by a neighbor. He was serious and professional. He opened the power box, examined the wires with a small flashlight, and used his measuring devices. I stood by him the whole time, my heart in my mouth. After almost an hour of silence, he turned to us. "Look, I'll be honest with you," he began, wiping his hands on a cloth. "This wasn't an accident or wear and tear. The main terminal screw was loose. This caused overheating that melted the circuit breaker and almost set the entire wiring on fire. You were very lucky." Lucas frowned. "What do you mean, loose? No one has touched it in years." Marco shrugged. "Well, someone did, and whoever did it knew what they were doing because it's not a common mistake. It was done on purpose." A heavy silence fell over us. I saw Lucas's mind working, trying to find someone to blame. An enemy at work? Someone who wanted to harm us? Julia stared at the destroyed power box with eyes full of fear. They were scared inside their own home, the place that should be their safe haven, and I was the culprit, the protector, the builder, the father. I was the monster they couldn't see. That night I couldn't eat. I sat in my armchair, staring into space, while Lucas and Julia talked quietly in the kitchen, locking doors and windows they had never locked before. They were afraid of an enemy outside, while the real enemy was sitting in the living room. The weight of my lie was greater than any concrete beam I had ever lifted. The bond we had worked so hard to build over the past few months was a sham because it was based on a rotten secret. I couldn't live like this anymore. Revenge had given me back my respect. Memory had given me back my family, but my cowardice now threatened to destroy everything again. I took a deep breath, gathered what courage I had left, and stood up. My knees cracked, but this time the sound was like something breaking inside me. I went to the kitchen. They fell silent when they saw me, their faces tired and worried. "Sit down," I asked, my voice firmer than I felt. "I need to tell you something." They sat down at the table, looking at me with curiosity and a hint of apprehension. I didn't beat around the bush. I started with the tea spilled on the carpet, the humiliation, the dark night in my room. I told them about the cold flame of revenge, about the dripping ceiling, about every little act of sabotage, and finally, I confessed about the loose screw in the fuse box. As I spoke, I didn't look at them. I looked at my hands on the table, the same hands that built and almost destroyed that house. When I finished, a deadly silence filled the room. I finally looked up. Julia was crying silently, her face covered by her hands. Lucas stared at me, his face an indecipherable mask of shock, anger, and deep pain. His expression was that of a son who had just discovered that his hero was, in fact, the villain. I said nothing more. I just waited for the sentence. I had put the last and heaviest beam in place, the truth. Now it remained to be seen whether the foundation of our family could bear the weight. If my story has taught you something, share this video. May my account serve as a warning and inspiration to value those we love in all stages of life.